Hey there, it's Matt. One of the topics I've been focusing on for this channel recently has been the various Ollama UIs. There are a lot of them, and they each have different focus areas that make them better or worse in different ways. But when you look at that long list on the Ollama repo, it's hard to know what the options are and who they're for. And in every video, I've asked, what is another UI that you really like, or that you've heard about, and that you'd like me to cover? There have been two requests that kind of bubble up, two requests that stood out more than others. One is LM Studio. Now, LM Studio is a bit of a weird one because it's not something you run on top of Ollama, but something you would run instead of Ollama. LM Studio is definitely a popular product, though I don't fully understand why, since it's just slower for almost everything that you do. And I find it a lot more complicated, especially to get started with. The main benefit that I can see is that it includes a UI with the runner. The only problem is it's not a very good UI. But maybe I just need to spend more time with it so I can see the magic of that product, because it's certainly not easier to use, at least not at first. Well, the other product that is often mentioned as an idea is to cover anything LLM. Now, I have to admit, I was a little reluctant to make a video about it. What it does, it turns out it does really well, but then there's all these other things that it tries to do that aren't so good. And I think my main problem with it is that it's just so ugly. But as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and some people love it. So I should not let that hold me back. So let's take a look at anything LLM. I've already installed it, and I've just done some quick testing. But let's give it a shot and see what we can do with it. So when you first open the product, you're greeted with what looks like a chat with a model. But it's really just the instructions to get up and running with anything LLM. Although it's definitely a tool that you can use as your main front end to a model, I think its main benefit is that it tries to make RAG really easy and really powerful. Does it do it well? Sort of, but with some big caveats. So on the left side is our workspace and the chat view. In anything, a workspace is basically a collection of information. And those workspaces can include files and documents, images, PDFs, and all sorts of other files that are used by the model to make conversations with it better and more applicable to your scenario. You can add lots of documents to anything, and then you take those documents and add them to a workspace. I've created the workspace called Main, so let's open it up and see what's there. So I've just asked my classic question of why is the sky blue? And it gives me a nice answer. But down at the bottom, you can see it says show citations. Well, that's interesting. Let's take a look. It's claiming that it found this answer, I think, through these three documents. Now, that's a little bit bizarre. This question is not covered by any of those three documents. It's purely using what's in the model about why is the sky blue, just like any other tool would. These are 3 of the 6 or 7 documents that are in my vector database, but they have no relevance to this question. So it's strange that they're brought up. But let's try asking a question that actually is relevant to my documents. What is a transformer? So that's a pretty good answer, and it gives me citations down at the bottom, which this time are actually relevant to the question. But you may notice something that isn't shown here. There's no way to select the model. You can definitely choose a model in settings, but once you set it, you're kind of stuck with it until you go back into settings and change it there. Now let's see how we get information into the database so that I can ask questions against it. I can come over to the workspace and click this little icon that looks like it's exporting files, but it's really about importing files into the workspace. So here's where we can add documents. I can drag and drop documents into this area and I'll add it to my list of all my documents. I can create folders as well, so I can organize those documents. And then once I have a bunch of documents in this My Documents area, I can select them and have them added to my workspace. On the same page, though it's a little weird, I can say fetch a website, which sounds a little bit better than it actually is. If I enter in a URL and then click fetch website, it'll download just that URL. It will not download any other URLs on the site, just a single page on that website. So if you wanted to download the entire website, let's say all the documents in the Ollama docs, you can't do that easily. You'd have to add each page one by one. And then over on this tab, I have data connectors. And this also looks maybe a little bit better than it actually is. I can point to a GitHub repo, which is awesome. I can say github.com/Ollama/Ollama. It doesn't recognize it, so you have to enter HTTPS at the beginning, so it will recognize that it's a valid repo URL. And then it will start to download. And you can see it says 12 files collected from Ollama/Ollama. Huh? There's a whole lot more than 12 files in Ollama/Ollama. 12 files are just what it found in the root of that repo. So there's no way to grab an entire repo, just all the files at the root? I don't know if that's all that useful. There's also an option for a YouTube transcript. So if you've got a URL for a YouTube video, you can paste that into the box for the URL. And then it'll download the transcript, and you can add that to your conversation. There's also a way to point to a Confluence page, which I have to assume the person who wrote this uses Confluence, because I can't think of any reason Confluence would ever come up in most situations otherwise. The only problem is that I tried adding the YouTube transcript and then having a conversation with that transcript, and it didn't seem to recognize that I'd uploaded anything to do with what's in the video. So maybe it's not perfect, but I've often found in other tools when adding lots of documents that are not in the same subject area, the performance of your RAG solution really degrades very, very quickly. So that may be what's happening here. You really should make sure that all the documents that are in your RAG solution and are going to be part of a query are related to each other, or at least related to the question. I wish there were more ways to organize the documents, much like the collections that you find in OpenWebUI. I also wish that I could see more of the name of the file. This is going to get pretty hard to manage pretty quickly. Let's now go to the settings for the workspace. First, there's General Settings. This just lets you set the name of the workspace and delete it. Then in Chat Settings, you can set the Workspace LLM provider. So if you want to use a different LLM for each workspace, you can do that. Below that is Chat Mode. Do you want to use Chat, which is going to provide answers with the LLM's general knowledge and document context that's found, or do you want to use Query, which will provide answers only if the document context is found? You can set how long you want the chat history to be, so how much context do you keep providing to the model with each question. And then you can set the prompt that's going to be used for this workspace, as well as the response that you get if you're in query mode and there's no information that's relevant. Finally, below that is LLM temperature. And it says this is for how random the response will be, but most would describe it as how creative the model can be. And the higher the number, the more random or incoherent is what it says. I don't know about incoherent. More creative is definitely the way to think about it. It's suggesting 1.0 is the maximum, which is interesting. Depending on where you look, most folks will say that the range is between 0 and 2. Some places will say 0 to 1. Some places will say 0 to 5. Other places I've seen have said any positive number works. Note that this temperature is the only parameter that we can change inside of anything LLM. The next section is vector database, and here we can say when you do a search and there are a bunch of matches, how many of those matches will be provided to the model. Under that is document similarity threshold. So depending on the algorithm that's used to do the nearest neighbor search or proximity search, you're going to get a score. Now, depending on the algorithm, that score is going to be a different range. Here we see 3 options for how similar the answer needs to be used by the model. Finally, there's a section for agent configuration. Now, this is pretty interesting. It does warn that tool calling is dependent on the model's capabilities and accuracy, and we can change the agent provider. So in this case, we're using Ollama, and for the model, you can use any of the models because all the models are supported for that in Ollama. And then what kind of agent skills do you want to enable? Most of these are enabled by default, like scraping websites, view and summarize documents, RAG, and long-term memory, but then it also has the ability to create charts, generate and save files to a browser, and live web search and browsing. Though live web search and browsing is sort of available. You come in here and you have to either choose Google search engine, and for that you need an API key, or you can use serper.dev, which is another tool that requires an API key. I've done another UI review for a tool called Page Assist, but what's interesting there is that it can also do a search using Google, DuckDuckGo, or Sogu, but no API keys are needed. That was really nice. Now let's go over to overall app settings and see what can be done over there. At the top is API keys. Now this is not API keys for OpenAI or any other service, but rather API keys that you want to create for this service, for anything LLM. So once you create an API key and you use the documentation to figure out the endpoints, you can write an application that uses that RAG system and model integration within your own applications. I think that's a pretty cool idea. I just don't know if it adds that much over just setting up RAG on your own, but it's interesting. Below API keys, we have Workplace Chat, and here's where we can export full chats that are done inside this application. This is really nice. It's not just the questions, which is all that gets stored in Ollama, but the questions as well as all the answers. So that's pretty awesome. And then there's appearance, and there's really nothing you can do here. You can customize the automatic messages that are displayed to users, but you can't change the appearance of the UI, which is something I was really hoping you could do for a section called Appearance. Next is LLM Preference. So we can choose a provider. Ollama is the one that obviously I'm going to choose, but you can also choose some others. That first option is a bit weird. Anything LLM is the choice, but it's going to use Ollama. So I can choose Ollama or anything LLM, which is Ollama. Okay, but then there's Hugging Face, Gemini, Anthropic, or a generic OpenAI API, and there's a bunch of other options here as well. But you can choose only one. And then you can set the URL and model here and token context window. I've seen other tools that let you set up a few different services here that you can select in the main UI, so it's a bit unfortunate that you can't do that. Next is transcription model. You really only have two choices here. There's anything LLM or there's OpenAI. And if you choose anything LLM, it's going to use Whisper, which is OpenAI, but you host it locally. But you don't have any option as to which model you're going to use. The Whisper small model is nice, but the large model is just so much better. So that's a bit frustrating that you can't choose that. Next, we have Embedding Provider, and here we can choose how embeddings are made. We have many of the same choices that we've had before in other applications. And for whichever one you've chosen, you have to set your base URL and model and max chunk length. Okay. There's a section underneath that, like a subsection, for text splitter and chunking preferences. And this is a setting that most tools have, and many of them make this same bizarre choice that we see here. We can set the text chunk size, but first off, it's setting it based on number of characters. And then it's setting it to the maximum number that the model will support, which is really, really bizarre. I would much rather see a setting of 5 or 10 or 15 sentences. So something that makes, semantically makes sense on its own rather than making a chunk size in characters. I found characters not to be a useful way of breaking that up. So this is frustrating with anything LLM. Next is Vector Database Provider. It's interesting that they give an option here and a lot of options. Your options are LanceDB, which is going to be, I assume, run in memory or it runs on this instance somehow. I'm not exactly sure how it's set up. Or you can use Chroma, which can also be done that same way depending on what language is used to build anything. But it looks like you need to host that yourself. And that's fine. It's super easy to run. Or you can use Pinecone. If you have a Pinecone vector database set up for enterprise use already, then this makes it really easy to work with. Or there's Zilla's Cloud, which I believe is the hosted version of Milvus. And then Qdrant and Weaviate and self-hosted Milvus and AstroDB. So there's a number of options for self-hosting as well as services up in the cloud for your vector database. And then below that, there's event logs. We can see all the things that have happened within the application. And then there's another section about privacy and data handling. Then there's a few other little icons down here in the lower left corner. It looks like you can donate to the author. And then we've got some documentation, and I assume that's going to the Discord. One of the strange decisions here is that the icons often are a little cryptic and not obvious. Hovering over an icon doesn't show you what the icon means, so you have to click on it to go wherever it goes and then come back to discover what that icon is for. So that's a little bit about anything LLM. What do I think? Well, I think it's a pretty good first stab at a RAG solution for different AI services. But like so many other tools, it's not perfect. There's a lot of things that are just weird about it. First, that UI. But then there's also the lack of ability to chunk based on sentences or words or something other than characters. And it offers a bunch of other connections to websites and to GitHub and YouTube transcripts, but they don't all work very well. Really, your best bet is uploading documents like PDFs or Markdown documents or text documents or anything like that. Of course, with PDFs, we've got all the problems that I've mentioned before about working with PDFs. This doesn't do any magic here. It's still the same kind of problems. And it feels like it's a bit of an enterprise product, or somebody has paid the person to build against a specific set of specs, and they've built that application and they're trying to let other people use it as well. Because like Confluence and just the way it's doing certain things feels very enterprisey. But that should provide a nice introduction to what anything LLM can offer, and why you might want to give it a shot. I hope this was useful for you. If you'd like to stay in touch with me and see what else interests me or get some behind-the-scenes info, consider my newsletter. You can find it at technoevangelist.com/newsletter. If you want a way to support me, consider the Patreon at patreon.com/technoevangelist. Someone recently asked me if there was another way to interact, such as Discord or Telegram. Is that something of interest? Do you already belong to too many of those rooms? I think it could be a cool way to go if you're okay with it. Anyway, thanks so much for being here. Goodbye. Coffee's better.